You're listening to Systemic Era Podcast. The failure was designed.
Historian exposes dark Civil War secret behind Trump's master plan, based on an article by Matthew Risser. Trump is not preparing for an election. He is preparing to police it. The story beneath the story. The source lays out a simple fact pattern. Even if the framing keeps reaching for drama, Trump is being described as preparing to make the 2026 midterms harder to vote in, easier to intimidate, and more useful to power than to democracy. The concrete elements named here are military presence near polling places, ballot-box seizure, voter purges, mail vote disruption, and ICE as a political weapon. That is not confusion. That is an architecture of suppression. Who holds the power? The real institutional power sits with the presidency, the executive agencies, the military chain of command, and the election-adjacent machinery that can be bent into a deterrence system. Trump does not need to invent new lawlessness from scratch. He needs enough compliant officials, enough bureaucratic fear, and enough confusion to make ordinary voting feel risky. That is the point. The source is right to connect this to a longer anti-democratic tradition and not a vague loss of norms, but a deliberate use of state power to narrow who can safely participate. The model is not a fair election with more scrutiny. The model is controlled participation under threat. Sabotage is the strategy. What matters in the source is not just the headline fear of election denial. It is the operational detailed purges, challenges, provisional ballot traps, shortened polling hours, moving sites without notice, bomb threats, and now the suggestion of ICE near polling places. That is a suppression stack. Each tactic alone can be dismissed by people who want to sound reasonable. Together, they form a system that makes legality look like administration and coercion look like procedure. This is where the piece is clearest about consequence. If millions of eligible voters are blocked or chilled, the outcome is not merely a tainted contest. It is a transfer of political power accomplished by shrinking the electorate until the result is pre-approved. That is what the steal looks like when it is dressed in bureaucracy. ICE should not exist as a polling tool. The source mentions ICE as part of the intimidation environment. That should not be treated as a policy tweak or a concern about messaging. If an immigration enforcement agency is being positioned to scare citizens away from voting, then the problem is structural, not managerial. ICE is already a coercive institution built to terrorize vulnerable communities. Turning it toward elections is not a misuse that can be politely corrected. It is proof of what the agency is for: concentrated state fear. The democratic response is abolition, not reform theater, not better training, not clearer guidance. An apparatus of fear does not become democratic because it is asked to be polite. Democrats are still underreacting. The source includes the familiar ritual of concern from democratic leadership paired with the equally familiar suspicion that this will amount to very little. That suspicion is earned. If the response to a systematic effort to preload the electorate against democracy is another emergency meeting in a press statement, then the party is treating sabotage as a communications challenge. That is not enough. The Democratic coalition cannot keep acting as though the threat is only that voters might become uninspired. The threat is that voters are being pushed, blocked, chilled, and narrowed. A party that wants to defend democracy has to confront the machinery that prevents people from entering it. Anything less is managerial surrender dressed up as seriousness. The source also leans on turnout as the main answer. Turnout matters, but turnout is not a magic spell. If the other side is spending its time making participation harder, then just vote harder is not strategy. It is abdication. The pattern is oligarchy with elections attached. The larger pattern here is familiar when democracy threatens power. Power does not always cancel elections outright. Sometimes it keeps the forms and corrupts the access. It keeps the ballot and rigs the conditions around it. It keeps the language of democracy while converting institutions into tools of exclusion. That is the political meaning of this story. It is not about one man's paranoia, or one party's bad talking points, or a messy election season. It is about a ruling bloc that appears willing to reduce the franchise to something manageable. The names in the source matter because they show where agency sits Trump. His agencies, compliant enforcers, and the institutions that let intimidation masquerade as administration. The warning is not abstract. If the state can be made to frighten people away from voting, then democracy is no longer being debated, it is being rationed. You've been listening to Systemic Error. Thanks to Alternet for today's article. With the automated voice of Kristen, thanks for listening.